Thank you all for attending today's webinar, Planning in the Jewish Tradition, a roadmap for emergent Jewish communities. My name's Corinne Arriaga, and I'm a transportation planner at the City of Sarasota, and I was born and raised in a conservative Jewish household. So I have a couple housekeeping announcements. So there's a handout that you can download in the handout section. It has some of the links that's going to be used in today's webinar, as well as some contact information. During the Q&A session, please use the chat function to submit questions. And please note this webinar is being recorded. As described in the flyer, this webinar is eligible for CM credits. The course number is 9246875. You can also find that in the webinar description, as well as in top of the GoToWebinar. So as I didn't mention earlier, but I am a member of the APA Florida's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee and a co-chair of the Partnership and Community Subcommittee. So I just want to give a little information on what the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee is. It was created in 2019 to develop a strategic diversity and inclusion plan for the Florida chapter of the American Planning Association. So after completing a member survey, the EDI committee created the Florida chapter EDI strategy, which includes an overview of the member needs and perspectives and corresponding implementation tasks. And so really the EDI, the American Planning Association Florida's goal is to celebrate equity, diversity, and inclusiveness by reaching and welcoming people of all backgrounds and experiences to be a part of and served by the planning profession. The EDI committee's goal is to build on current efforts to increase the diversity and inclusiveness of the chapter and leadership and ensure all communities can contribute and be valued. So that's really what today's webinar is about. We have two speakers here with us today. We have the Florida chapter president, Wiatt Bowers, and Rabbi Dr. Unger. So Wiatt Bowers, AICP, is a transportation planning project director with Atkins. He's 27 years of transportation and land use planning experience, and his primary expertise include corridor studies and master plans, complete streets, long-range transportation plans, transit planning, active transportation studies, traffic impact studies, mobility plans, and travel demand modeling. And Rabbi Dr. Unger is the Executive Director of Programs at New Synagogue in Palm Beach. He previously served as Director of Urban Programs and was an Associate Professor of Government and Politics, with a focus on economic development and public administration at Wagner College. He also served as a project manager at the Staten Island Chamber of Commerce Foundation that received a major HUD or HUD grant and was a senior research fellow at NYU Marin Institute of Urban Management. He's authored 2 books, A Jewish Public Theology, God in the Global City in 2019, and Business Improvement Districts in the United States, Private Government and Public Consequences in 2016. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Wiatt Bowers.
Great, thank you, Corinne. As Corinne mentioned, she was born and raised in a conservative Jewish household. I was born and raised and continue to practice in a Reform Jewish household. Many of you, of course, probably know me as the APA Florida president or as a transportation planner, but in one of my many side roles, I'm very involved in our local Jewish community here in Jacksonville. The Jewish community, like any other community, is not we're not a homogeneous group. But in trying to do a couple of just compilations just for demographic analysis and understanding a little bit better of our makeup, I'm going to try and simplify it. Basically, there are 3 predominantly large denominations of Judaism in the US, in North America, and that's the Reform movement, the Conservative movement, and the Orthodox movement. Within those, there are then subsets. So for example, within Orthodoxy, you have modern Orthodox, some of the ultra-Orthodox, and there's subsets of that, and I'm sure Rabbi Unger, you'll get into a little bit of it. Just kind of a basic knowledge, the general premise in the US is that the Reform and Conservative movements together are about 70% of American Jews. By the way, American Jews are about 7 million in the United States out of 15 million or so worldwide. Interestingly, though, the growth is predominantly in the Orthodox sector. And so while today, for example, those that are 65 and older in the United States, only 3% identify as Orthodox. If you look at the younger set in ages 18 to 29, it's more like 17 to 20% identifying as Orthodox. And we will talk about that and kind of the growth as I go through some of this, and again, as Rabbi Unger speaks. As I mentioned earlier, their total worldwide population of Jews is about 15 million. Roughly, the US and Israel each have 7 million, and then there's another million scattered throughout the other countries, predominantly in Canada, Europe, and a little bit in Australia. Now, again, that 90% of that total is in the United States and Israel, and there are mixed different surveys, some that say Israel has more Jews and some that say the US has more Jews. Interestingly, the Orthodox, which some also say, and I'm talking about the ultra-Orthodox now, some will use the term Hasidic, some will use the term Haredi, which is more of an Israeli term, and they are somewhat interchangeable, but again, as I said, there are different denominations or sects even within the denomination. But as an overall, if we're talking about Hasidic or ultra-Orthodox Jews in the United States, it's about 700,000, which means that it's 10% of the overall Jewish population. In Israel, it comprises about 1.2 million, or almost 20% of the Israeli Jewish population. Life expectancy for ultra-Orthodox Jews is actually very high, even though a number of them live in poverty, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But average age for men is 83, average life expectancy for women is 86. And again, in terms of growth rates, the Jewish community as a whole is growing very slowly, about 1% annually. But the Haredi or ultra-Orthodox movement is growing more at 4% or more a year. And that's predominantly, again, in the US and in Israel. As an example of the growth, average, household size, number of children in households. We generally think about the US as somewhere around 2 children per household. That seems to fit in the Jewish market as well in the US. In Israel, they have a little bit more, a few more children, and average about 3 children per secular Israeli household. Secular is just a term used in Israel predominantly for anyone that is not of the observant Jews, so those that are considered Orthodox or Haredi. Within the Haredi sect, it is 6 to 7 children per household. So you can imagine that growth rate is exponential, and definitely something that we need to be thinking about in terms of planning. Now, in terms of things like assimilation, a lot of, the Reform movement was created in the premise of Jews moving from Europe to the US and kind of blending in. That obviously is not a strong suit of, it's not what you see prevalently in the Orthodox communities. And many of the people that are born into the Haredi and ultra-Orthodox movements stay in those movements. And even the, say, 20% or so who eventually, leave that movement, many of them stay observant. Now, speaking of people moving, there's a pretty strong influx right now of Jews coming to Florida. We're not going to Jerusalem yet, but we'll get there in a minute. But when Jews are in Florida, they're leaving New York, for example, for South Florida. There's been a bunch of articles here just in the past couple of months. There was one called Jerusalem on the Atlantic, talking about how South Florida is emerging as a hub of Jewish life. For Latin Jews, which we consider Sephardic, whether they be Ashkenazic from Eastern European Orthodox Jews, secular Israelis, immigrants from the Northeast, as we're saying. And why are they leaving New York for Florida? Well, along with lots of other people, jobs, tax base, relatively cheap housing, or at least used to be relatively cheap housing. But a really interesting one is the school choice. A lot of observant Jews put their children into private schools, and Florida offers up to $7,500 in scholarships for private school tuition. And that is a huge attraction for many of them. Now, as we said, it's predominantly in South Florida. If we think about the Florida population as a whole, there's 660,000 Jews approximately in Florida statewide, so that's 3% of the statewide population. Of that, about 75% of them live in the 3 counties of South Florida. 120,000 in Miami-Dade, 145,000 in Broward, and almost 220,000 in Palm Beach County. Then there's another, say, 50,000 in the Tampa Bay area, 50,000 in Central Florida, Orlando. Jacksonville has about 20,000, and then maybe there's another 75, 80,000 that are scattered throughout other parts of the state. So a little bit about me, real quick. Again, I was born and raised in a Reformed Jewish household. I went to Jewish summer camp. It's what a lot of Jewish overnight summer camp. It's what a lot of us do. And I was in a camp that was part of an Israeli youth movement that focused on the kibbutz life. For anyone who is not familiar with kibbutzim, it's an agrarian enclave set up to work as a collective. It worked on generally socialistic principles, but a lot of what a lot of us think of as really good urban planning. And the Judaism that I have is really focused heavily on tikkun olam and repairing the world. That is, I see a direct connection between what I do in my planning day life and what I believe morally in my Jewish upbringing, and what I continue to teach as I've been teaching in our synagogue Sunday school for teens. I teach teens over the last probably 6 to 8 years, and we talk about modern Jewish issues. We don't get into too much Hebrew instruction or too much deep religious thought. But I will say, we do spend a lot of time talking about Israel. I've been to Israel a number of times. And on my most recent visit, I wanted to bring up a couple slides from Jerusalem, if we can. And this is really an interesting perspective when you start to think about what happens from a planning standpoint. Let me start with, in Tel Aviv, you could be walking around on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, on Saturday, and people are all out in the parks, and they're walking along the beach, and they're at the beach, and a lot of the shops are open. Tel Aviv is what we consider a very secular, open city. Jerusalem is a much more religiously closed city. So these images are what it looks like on Shabbat in central Jerusalem, on the main pedestrian promenade, and the tracks are for the light rail line. There is no public transportation in Israel on the Sabbath, with the exception of the city of Haifa, where there's a negotiated agreement. In my trips to Jerusalem, I end up being there quite often on Shabbat. And if we can scroll through these, Patty, real quick, just as it's challenging if you can't get somewhere via walking. So you can see in this case, this was right after Purim, which is one of those big celebratory holidays. Everyone's out partying, and at 2 o'clock, the police came down the road and they said, okay, time's up, holiday's over, Shabbat is coming. Jewish holidays start at sundown, and so Jerusalem starts to shut down every Friday at about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, so that people can make their way home and be at home, cook their Shabbat dinner in time to be with their families. Public transportation stops running. I was going to visit a friend in synagogue. The synagogue was 2 miles away from my hotel. I was planning to walk, and then it started to rain, and it was cold, and I had to go find a taxi. And they're really hard to come by on Shabbat, and the ones that are operating have a pretty captive market, and you can imagine even when it was raining, it was more. I paid $25 to go 2 miles in a cab, because that was my option as public transit was not running. The next slide, Patty. So the following morning, Saturday morning, this is Mamilla, which is like the luxury shopping mall in Israel. On a Saturday morning, completely empty. There's a pedestrian promenade that walks you through into the old city of Jerusalem, but all of the shops are closed. They reopen Saturday night at about 8 o'clock at night, again, depending on when sundown is during the year. One more slide. So the next day, on Sunday, was really interesting. I saw a number of Orthodox men running to get on buses. And I didn't know what was going on. I thought maybe they were going to study at yeshiva, at school, which we'll talk about. I later then had to go to the train station to get from Jerusalem back to Tel Aviv. I learned on this day there was a Hasidic rabbi who had died, I think on Thursday. Rabbi Kanievsky was 94 years old, speaking to the point of how long a lot of these people live. And his funeral was that day in a suburb of Tel Aviv. They were expecting nearly 1 million people. As I mentioned, there's 1.2 million Orthodox in Israel. They ended up with 600,000. They were crushing the buses and the trains to get there. And they actually shut down most of the routes into that suburb so that you couldn't take your car in, you had to walk. It is a really interesting component to understand as I transition this to Rabbi Unger, that many of these communities, again, we're talking about quite often in the US and in Israel, that are poor, many do not own cars at all. And as shown, they're definitely not using them on Shabbat. So I think it brings up a lot of really interesting planning issues for us to think about. And as such, I'm going to transition here to Rabbi Unger.
Thank you, Wiatt. And I appreciate your sort of broad survey of modern Jewry. And I just noticed that Kareem is from a conservative background, you're from a Reform background, I'm from an Orthodox background. So it's a pretty good representation of the American Jewish community right here on this panel. So I'm appreciative of that. With having multiple voices. While I may not, have the black suit and the white shirt on, just for the sake of introduction and breaking down within Orthodoxy, which is the denomination of Judaism and the community we'll be focusing on today, because it really does have very specific planning needs. Let me break down a little bit further, as Wiatt sort of hinted I might do, the makeup of the Orthodox community itself, both here and in Israel. I'm focusing especially on American Jewry, but it's pretty parallel with the Orthodox community in Israel as well. The statistics might be slightly different, but certainly the lifestyles are very similar. So I'm what you might call from a modern Orthodox background, which means I would obviously wear contemporary clothing, not traditional Jewish dress, and I might be more engaged in the secular world intellectually. But in terms of taking a position, for example, I've been a professor, as Wiatt mentioned, at a secular university beyond the walls of the yeshiva or of a Jewish seminary. So I've taken on a deep secular education and believe in its value. But ultimately, in terms of Sabbath observance, laws of kashrut, or eating kosher food, and the kosher dietary laws, and even civil and commercial aspects of one's life governed by Jewish law, both civil and religious, I ultimately would say that the Orthodox community is pretty unified on that. So whether one is dressed in modern garb and identifies as more modern Orthodox and engages more deeply in the secular world or not, and there are many Haredim, what we would call the ultra-Orthodox, let's say. I prefer the word Haredim, or just more Orthodox, if you will. They too, many of them are engaged in business and take on, some of them take on higher education in the secular world. So the lines are pretty porous. But there is certainly that modern Orthodox Haredi distinction in terms of just the way the Jewish denominations think about themselves and self-define. Sometimes practically, sometimes a little bit ideologically. But in the end, the Orthodox community is still a pretty united community in terms of its needs, which speaks directly to planning in just a minute. The fastest growing element, though, within Orthodox, even with the breakdown of the modern, and the Haredi elements, is still the Haredi community. I hate to say less modern, but for the sake of this conversation, we'll say, certainly the more, clearly defined Orthodox community outside of modern Orthodoxy is clearly growing. Its birth rate is higher, and it is, building institutions and communities, which we'll address in just a minute, very quickly. And so, by the way, just in terms of longevity, it's interesting to think about that as well. It is true, Wiatt, that the more religious, the longer one lives. There's a physician, Dr. Neil Lerman at the Mayo Clinic. I just thought of this as you were speaking, who's done studies of this. And religious communities, because of community, as well as walking to synagogue, the actual exercise of it, and then the social outlet of having ongoing support system as one ages, apparently actually has genuine clinical benefits in terms of cardiovascular disease and living longer, regardless of diet or other habits. So there actually is a scientific basis to religious individuals, and that's across faiths, by the way, living much longer. With all that said in mind, what are we talking about when we think about the Orthodox community in terms of planning? And this would go for more modern Orthodox folks as well, whether or not they send their kids to university, which is kind of a hallmark of the modern Orthodox universe, and perhaps, live in less clearly defined Jewish areas. The one facet that unites all of Orthodoxy, as these communities grow and spring up, and South Florida is seeing this really tremendous growth for all the reasons why I mentioned in terms of educational opportunity, housing opportunity, taxes. The one issue, and this is the takeaway, if there's one word I want everyone to think about and remember and reflect upon when they walk away from this webinar, is walkability. So if we could just pull up the new Urbanism Congress slide, that would be great, or URL, that would be great. There we go, thank you. So having been a professor, as well as having been involved in the trenches of urban economic development as well, practically as a practitioner, the way I like to frame, both for myself, as well as for those with whom I talk, both within the Jewish community and outside of it, I think the clearest theoretical framework for thinking about building communities, planning communities for the Orthodox Jewish population, which, as we just mentioned, is springing up throughout South Florida. And by the way, across the world, and we'll see some URLs and websites that show that as well, is the new urbanism. The live, work, and play theory that I was sort of trained in thinking about, walkability really speaks to our needs. So the new urbanism really is a theoretical framework to think about. And if we just look, and by the way, it speaks to it substantively, not just in terms of creating walkability, but the idea of building community through walking. Really actually substantively in terms of content is really at the heart of the kinds of communities springing up across the world and certainly in South Florida. So I'm just going to read out loud this first paragraph, and all of you probably know this, but it's worth hearing it out loud. Jewish tradition says, say something out loud. In the mind, silently, it kind of is a little bit murkier than when you actually clarify it vocally. So new urbanism is a planning and development approach based on the principles of how cities and towns have been built, I would add, for the last several millennia as an Orthodox Jew and rabbi, not just for the last several centuries. Walkable blocks and streets, housing and shopping in close proximity, accessible public spaces, new urbanism focuses on human-scaled urban design. I would add into this, from the Jewish perspective, the academy or the yeshiva, the seminary, both for men and for women, the idea of ongoing learning and communities built around an educational center. Usually communities have that also within walking distance. Now, by the way, this is not just because Orthodox Jews like to walk places, and some, let's say in Israel, may not have as many cars, because in America, actually, many do have cars. That's a little bit of a difference between the Israeli and the American Orthodox populations, actually. The reason is actually religious, based on faith. One cannot drive an Orthodox Jewish interpretation of Scripture on the Sabbath. Friday night sunset through Saturday night, an hour or so afterwards. 25-hour period from Friday through Saturday night, sunset through full darkness on Saturday night. Wiatt was talking about trying to get a cab in Jerusalem on a Saturday, on a rainy Saturday, to make a visit. Well, that's because in Jerusalem, the holy city, it's going to be pretty hard because it's a pretty Sabbath observant city to find a cab on a Saturday morning. So Jews need to walk on Saturday. The reason being is because lighting a fire, harnessing nature, is forbidden on the Sabbath from the Orthodox point of view. And so lighting the ignition of a car actually creates fire. One is creating on the Sabbath and harnessing nature. So one refrains from doing so. So because the Sabbath is so central to Jewish life, it's a time when families gather, people spend their day in synagogue, studying, gathering with friends. It's just it's sort of a festival every single week. And the Jewish calendar is based on it, and the Sabbath is second only in importance to Yom Kippur, the holiest day on the calendar. It's even more important than Rosh Hashanah, technically speaking, in terms of Jewish law. It's such a fundamental, piece of Jewish faith that the fact that one cannot drive by Orthodox Jewish teaching on the Sabbath from Friday night through Saturday night means one has to have, by dint of necessity, walkable communities. So the new urbanism really, I think, is the framework to think about. And that means, if one is rushing home on a Friday, isn't it easier to be closer to home than not from work? Isn't it easier to have your school closer to home than not from work? Isn't it easier to have your commercial retail script? That's why I mentioned I wrote a book on business improvement districts. Having a contiguous commercial script, isn't it easier to have all of that centrally located because one is kind of always in a constant state of preparation, if you will, for the Sabbath. And so this idea of walkability is really grafted onto the Jewish community, and I think the new urbanism speaks to that really well. We can take that URL off at this point. And what it does is also build very, very tight communities. And so we have walkability, and we have other prescriptions as well around that. So, for example, one also can't carry on the Sabbath. So one has to build, and this is, a hotbed of discussion nationally and sometimes globally. One has to, create a private domain in a small city of, let's say, under 600,000 people. That's kind of the rough figure a lot of rabbis use to qualify, a space which may not be qualified to be called a private domain. But if you've got a relatively small city of a couple of 100,000 folks, you can somehow use telephone poles and wires and then maybe put up a couple of extra implements. And I'm going to ask that we put up for this the Lower Merion Eruv URL, if we can, from Philadelphia, because they have a pretty good explanatory site, to create a private domain within which one can, ERUV is a spelling, if you ever want to look it up in Google, what this is all about, this word Eruv. It creates a private domain within which one can carry on the Sabbath while walking. Now, why is that so important? Because it means one can then push a baby carriage, one can carry, some food over to a friend for Sabbath lunch. It creates, again, a sense of community. So not only do these strictures, not carrying on Sabbath, for example, not driving on Sabbath, not only do they, create, the need for walkability, but they do exactly what new urbanism says to do, which is they build community substantively, proactively, positively. So not only negative prohibitions by dint of the reality of living according to their strictures, for those who observe them, they actually build community. So we're talking about very tight-knit communities, and the majority of folks, 70 to 80% of folks, are retained by these communities. And then many of those who leave still remain Orthodox in some form or fashion, maybe modern Orthodox, maybe a little less so than perhaps a Hasidic upbringing, a Hasidic community, but certainly the observance and that feeling of community, that need, that drive, for community, which I think is a very powerful statement nowadays. And the new urbanism is a response to the fragmentation of postmodern life. So I think that drive for community is, is very important to consider when thinking about planning. Can we pull up, if we have, that Eruv URL, if it's available? Okay, I'm going to move on. Hopefully we'll get to that at some point. So we have this idea of creating a private domain by using, wires, sometimes visible, sometimes not visible, around a municipality filled with Orthodox Jews. We have this idea of needing to live, work, play, and learn. I'm adding that word learn into the new urbanism mantra of live, work, and play within a walkable community. Now, there are other things to consider in this regard. Sidewalks, something as simple as having really walkable sidewalks. Street lights that work, because if there's going to be cars coming through, it's not a pedestrian mall, then we need to have safe crossings. So planners really need to take into account and get down in the weeds of what it means to create not only attractive, we all take for granted the aesthetic, attractive communities when Orthodox folks move in, but also safe, walkable communities. And I just want to put that out there because it's something often overlooked. But one doesn't want to walk on the side of a road to get somewhere. One wants a nice, walkable street that's safe and feels comfortable and has some width to it, to push a baby carriage. If you've got the Eruv up, here we go. So just to take a look, let's read. I'm going to read that first paragraph out loud, and then I'm going to move on to just some other examples of this. Torah law. Torah means the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. Torah law forbids the transportation of objects in a public domain between a private and a public space. So I can't carry a loaf of bread from my house to my neighbor's house, meaning unless there's like some kind of indoor tunnel, if you will. But I can't walk out in the street with it unless there's some kind of Eruv, some some kind of wire or use of telephone poles that we can say are contiguous, either natural implements, amplified by some artificial implements, as a case may be, and mix it up. If we need to fill in certain gaps, because telephone poles are too far apart, let's say, we need to have that space created in order to, build and forge community. So really, we're talking all about walkability. The end game is building community, which actually helps longevity and spiritedness and the growth of that same. So then we go down, look at, if we go down to numbers 1 and 2, restrictions. The area has to be completely enclosed with only very limited gaps. The area must be a single residence or under a single ownership. So if you see this real life example here, in Lower Merion, which is, I guess, part of Philadelphia, we have enclosed the area indicated on the map that can be found by following the link on this website. Fences, this is what I wanted to get at. Fences, walls, natural boundaries like steep hills, cliffs, and channels can be utilized when constructing an area. So if you ever hear about this and you hear about poles going up with wires, typically that's not the whole thing. Typically that's just to fill in gaps between spaces that are just too wide, between a natural implement. Some might define that width too far as maybe 17 feet or wider. So there are ways to use natural things already there. People are concerned about zoning. It's not such a burden, actually. It represents, I think, more symbolically than what it actually is physically, this idea of the area. But again, no carrying, no driving, hence walkability, hence. Okay, just a couple of other points before we look at some other examples of this. Now remember, when I come from an urban development background and economic development background, so I'm interested in commercial strips and economic viability of communities as much as I am in the aesthetics and the design piece of things, and infrastructure piece. So my concern always is jobs creation, attractive commercial retail strips, property values. What you see in these Orthodox communities as they spring up is, and this is again part of new urbanism in terms of its vision, how it imagines municipalities. You'll see the growth of contiguous commercial strips, not a strip mall, but a walkable commercial strip, most often, I mean predominantly, both here and in Israel, filled with mom and pop stores. Now, what does that mean on the ground for a community in terms of economic development? What that means is jobs creation. It could mean the growth of a strong middle class, which is a real issue in this country and the developed world in terms of the loss of manufacturing. It means a lot of local hires. Typically, if you go through any Hasidic neighborhood, anywhere, you'll find not only, like in any, community, folks hiring from within their community, but you'll also, folks hiring from without their community, meaning from outside. You'll see lots of folks coming in and getting jobs in retail establishments. So you see a real middle-class, old-fashioned mom and pop commercial strip typically opens up. Food stores, hardware stores, stores that little sort of grocery stores that sell paper goods, and you're dealing with washing dishes for a family of 8 to 15. So a lot of paper goods are sold. Little stores, but they're owned by folks. Jobs are created, and you create this really vibrant middle-class tax base if there's a feeling of positive growth, and if that positive growth in fact does occur. Property values tend to stabilize and develop when Orthodox communities grow. We also see a need for true affordable middle-class housing. Not everyone, can easily support a family with a lot of kids and be a tradesperson or a small shop owner. So we need some kind of affordable housing, but for middle-class folks. So that needs to be thought through. What does that look like? And we've got an example of that coming up on the URL from England, actually, in an Orthodox community there. You'll see that you'll find cohesive communities, middle-class communities, and strong focus on education, which I think is really valuable. Wiatt mentioned a lot of Orthodox Jews are moving to Florida because of the tuition issue, because Orthodox Jews, like folks from any other religious faith, will send their children to parochial schools. Parochial schools are private schools that cost money. But that deep dedication to education, and even if it's Talmudic, which is rabbinic thought, a lot of it is focused on critical thinking, casuistry, deep logic and deep use of reason. Those are transferable skills towards other professions, towards higher education, in terms of thinking and logic and reasoning ability among young people, among young men and women engaged in Jewish thought and Jewish education seriously. So you find middle-class communities devoted to education, seeking, affordable housing in the sense that it should be reasonable for a large middle-class family, in walkable communities, and they're visiting each other on Sabbath, because when you have an Eruv, you can carry. And centered around not just shopping and recreation, as in the new urbanism, but additionally the academy, the local parochial school, seminary, or if you will, in the Hebrew, the yeshiva. These are strong middle-class, strong family-centered communities. And there's a lot of upward growth. You'll see, within 2 or 3 generations, lots of folks investing further in local properties, developing further businesses. These are really growing, vibrant, dynamic communities that contribute tremendously economically. Now, let's move on. I want to show you one of these cohesive communities. You'll see a map just with labels on it, so it'll sort of bring this idea to life. Here we go. In Mexico, there's a development not yet opened, but it seems underway for a Haredi community, a strictly Orthodox community. First of all, before we even go into where the buildings are and how they place the different structures, because it's very representative, and hopefully will bring together what I've said. Notice it kind of seems in the middle of nowhere, or in a less developed area. This is really seeming in the middle of nowhere. But you will find a lot of ultra-Orthodox communities going up in areas that seem a little bit isolated. Why? We can't sort of call and response. We're not in a class or in a meeting right now or in a seminar room, but because property is likely cheaper. And Orthodox Jews, they want to have a community space of their own to some degree. But again, they'll welcome in folks for retail. They'll certainly work with others. But, the value of it is, the price and the sense of being able to build one's own community with some degree of autonomy. So there's a reason why it kind of seems placed on an open field. Or to go into a friendly state like Florida, where there is that tuition option, tax option, and it's clearly a friendly state towards Orthodox Jews and many of the values they carry. So let's look at if we can move the cursor around wherever you start. That's great. We'll just look. So there's your shopping strip, the mall. Now remember, this mall will not necessarily have chain stores, chain stores, because a lot of those chain stores might sell non-kosher products if it's a local, food hall or what have you. So it's going to have locally owned businesses. It might have some, non-locally owned businesses too. Dunkin' Donuts is has done a very good job of franchising some of its franchises, under kosher supervision, for example. Maybe there'll be a Dunkin' Donuts with kosher supervision, who knows? But a lot of it will be local, homegrown folks creating employment opportunities for each other and for those who come in and get jobs from beyond the community. So you're talking about local business growth. Again, local economic development in the real old-fashioned way, mom and pop stores, not big box stores. And that's local jobs creation. So the mall represents that, and that's your retail strip here. Notice everything, by the way, is really walkable. Housing, right? Houses for rabbis, because the rabbis are sort of like the leaders of the community. They may not be the formal mayor, but people look to their clergy, like in any religious leader of that community, for leadership, moral leadership, and sometimes practical policy guidance. Not formal vote, in a local legislature, obviously not elected, but certainly guidance. And they'll go to them with personal questions. And the rabbis also are faculty for the seminary. So it's like faculty housing as well. Then you'll see houses, you'll see some, Avrechem is the word. Avrechem is a word that means those who are basically the equivalent of postgraduate students. A lot of gentlemen in the Orthodox community will learn well into their young manhood, even while married and having a family. There's a value on a long-term study of scripture and Jewish law, Bible, and Talmud. Many times in wives' work, actually. So you have a very strong, highly educated group of women who are going out into the world and doing computer work, accounting work, some teaching as well in other schools outside the Orthodox community or in the more modern Orthodox community, while husbands learn. Not all, but a good portion, certainly. So you have graduate student housing, and that includes housing for families, and they're subsidized. And by the way, by private philanthropy, not necessarily by government, but by private philanthropy. Then housing. You'll see the houses are also, even among just regular family homes, not for graduate students or rabbinic faculty of these seminaries, you'll see lots of housing close together. not because there's any particular Jewish thought that attached homes or homes close together are any more valuable than homes on big properties with big backyards or front yards, just because people want to live close together. Again, it's that driving sense of community, popping by someone's house unannounced on a Saturday with a pie saying, let's break some bread together, or with a hollow loaf, if you will, and sharing that together. So you'll see that. Then the educational campus. Now, again, what I said here to add to the new urbanism is that you have the school at the center. It's not just the mall or the retail strip, I'll call it, from a new urbanist and urban economic development point of view, but an actual educational campus. That will include everything from K through 12, through the college years, the graduate years, both for men and for women. Often men and women will study separately in more Orthodox communities. And it's really the center, literally physically the center. This diagram and this plan has it right. It's the center of the community, because the value in learning is so great that even those business owners or people who leave the community for a job, men or women, they set aside time to study at night. They'll stop by the yeshiva and take an hour or two, sometimes every night, sometimes once a week, and cover some material to sort of continuing education, if you will, in religious studies. So the educational campus is central. Sports center, that's actually increasing. There is some need more and more. Young Orthodox men, you'll see them playing basketball just like anywhere else. There is an increasing value on sports. It's not the center of things, but it's a nice thing to have, and they can use that as well as a social ball facility for other events. And let's see what else the cursor takes us. I guess that's about it. And by the way, the way that would look is you would literally see around this square of the map of this planned community for an Orthodox Jewish development, you would see, again, the telephone wires with some string on top, and maybe they would do some shrubbery here and there, and then fill in the gaps with some actual new poles. And you would see some kind of symbolic representation of this community as a private domain within which one could carry, like it's one big backyard. So on the Sabbath, one can carry. And so that idea of it being one big private domain, again, substantively adds to the feeling that, hey, we're in a community together, we're in this together, we're growing this together, we're invested in this together, morally, spiritually, for our families, for our community. It's a real driving sense of collective destiny, shared collective destiny, while still valuing the individual. Some go into business, some stay on and study. It's quite a unique experience. I think speaks to the best of American values as well. Let's go on and just see one more example of what housing might look like. One of the bigger issues in the Orthodox Jewish community, both modern as well as the Haredi sector, more traditionalist sector, is housing. If we could, you see there's a gated community, I guess. You can go to the English, the British URL from bbc.com. There we go. So Gateshead in England has a historic and really renowned, if you will, one of the Harvards of the Chiefs, a really renowned, world-class seminary. And so, as I just said, the Mexican example, and this is around the country, it's happening in South Florida, it happens in Israel, communities will grow up around the academy, around the value of education. Again, K through 12 and well beyond, into the college, the equivalent of the college years. And so what's needed then is affordable housing, in addition to faculty housing, where to put the faculty, these esteemed rabbis who teach. What do we do with families? Not everyone can afford a large property. So the issue of housing is really important. And you'll see lots of large Orthodox families and smaller housing units. And those houses require some special implements. So if we go down, you can see if we scroll down a little bit, we can stop right there. You can see that, let's see. Here, if you look at the last paragraph, there was something, we just missed it. Okay, well, here, we can read this one, that's enough. The three-story, four-bedroom houses have been designed to meet the specific cultural requirements of the Orthodox Jewish community. This is fine, including an internet-connected kitchen, dining and living spaces with study facilities. Even in the kitchen, even in the dining room, there has to be some nook left for study. You might see a little podium or lectern. You'll certainly see space for bookcases. The value in education is that vital. Even the kitchens have to be designed a certain way. an Orthodox Jew who observes the kosher laws, doesn't mix meat and dairy. And so some people, just to make it really, how shall I put this, really the highest level of being able to observe this if possible without buckets to put one's dishes in every time one washes a steak meal versus a macaroni and cheese meal, a meat meal versus a dairy meal. We'll have two sinks, for example. And so there's a lot of sort of detail in the design of the house. We're not here to talk about design of housings per se, but it is worthwhile noting that the houses themselves need certain requirements to fulfill the mandates of Jewish law. Now, what's important about that from our perspective, outside of this community, let's say, for those of us who are just thinking about it, reflecting on it, wondering about it, think of all the jobs creation. Think of the contractors at work, all the fitting that needs to be done. So we're talking about economic engines here. I always like to bring that to bear. It's often forgotten as we look at what may seem different or outside the norm for many. We're talking about lots of trades that are served by the exponential growth of this housing. And the idea of affordable housing for growing families that make economic contributions and develop, in these ways, I think, has some substance, has some viability to it. And it's something we should reflect upon from an economics perspective. So that's where we are as of now. I could go on and on about, the nature of retail, and population growth in different ways, modern Orthodox, ultra Orthodox. Modern Orthodox communities, just as an aside, the kind of community that I might be more involved in as a practitioner and academic, doesn't quite have that degree of condensed life to it. Might be a little more spread out, but in the end, even I, in my seemingly more modern community, can walk everywhere, not only to the synagogue, but to the retail strip. And while not everyone in my community might wear black coats and white shirts, we can still literally walk to the kosher butcher, walk to the local coffee shop. And that's something we think about when moving somewhere and putting down our deposits. So with that having been said, I think we'll turn it back to any questions or thoughts or comments.
Great, thank you. Hey, Corinne, I'm gonna jump in with a couple more thoughts that I thought about while he was talking. A couple that I did not, I'd written down some things and I skipped over it, but one, while Patty is getting my images up, I'll talk about a couple other things. So interestingly, I think we talked about, I mentioned some of the poverty questions, which are definitely bigger, as you pointed out, in Israel than they are in the US. What's very interesting in Israeli Haredi society is that the women are starting to work significantly, almost to the point of matching the workforce percentage in secular society. And that's having its substantive changes on the community. Imagine if you have 5, 6, 7 kids. Now maybe you've been having them, and they range in age from 22 down to 2. So you have the 22 or 20-year-old watching the younger one while you're at work. But the daycare questions and how that all plays in into society, as well as opening up it's a very insular community, the more ultra-Orthodox you are, especially in Israel. For example, there's something called kosher phones. You cannot have a cell phone, for example, that has internet on it. So no smartphones for now. Lots of them have found their way and have 2 sets of phones. But interestingly, again, Jerusalem is filling up. Lots of Israel is pretty dense. This is a city I went to visit when I was visiting with my friends in Hadera, which is between Tel Aviv and Haifa. We went out to this new community called Harish. This is in essence, a new town, if we think about from planning principles. And it follows a lot of what Rabbi was just showing. And you could just scroll through these, Patty, but basically this is a town that was founded in 2011 that today has about 20,000 people in it and is planned for 100,000 people. And all of this has been built in the last decade. It's out in the middle of nowhere, but once you're in it, it feels, there's some great bikeways, really nice wide sidewalks, a nice semi-building of a main street that's happening. And that's the main street there. Different levels of housing types. One thing you won't see very much in Israel anymore is new single-family development. Purely, there's just not enough land to make that a usable concept, and the home values are such that you would see mid-rise and high-rise. which brings up another point. If you think about it, if you're in an 8-story building and it's Shabbat, are you going in the elevator? And so there's this thing called the Shabbat elevator, quite often, where the buttons are all pushed automatically. So you can imagine if you were in a very large condominium building or a tall hotel building, it might be faster to take the stairs than let it stop at every floor going up to a 30 or 40-story building. But thinking about pushing buttons, I wanted to bring up a question of transportation and safety, and just use an example here in Jacksonville. This happened, Rabbi mentioned Yom Kippur earlier. That is the Sabbath of Sabbaths. It's the most holy day in our Jewish calendar. And we have an Orthodox synagogue here, and a lot of the people, of course, walk to shul, to congregation. And it's on one side of a 6-lane, 8-lane arterial, and the people live on the other side. And you come up to the traffic light, you don't push the button for the crosswalk because that wouldn't work in Shabbat. The way that intersection had been set up, and the intersections on this state arterial, were such that if the button wasn't pushed, it assumed that it was cars on the cross street, and it would be maybe 15 seconds to cross. If you push the button, then you get a full minute to cross. The Orthodox synagogue realized the issue and worked with the city of Jacksonville and the state Department of Transportation to install automatic pedestrian detection, kind of like a radar at the intersection on the one crosswalk. Interestingly, there are people in that congregation who felt that going underneath that radar and being detected was a problem for the Sabbath, and would instead use the other crosswalk, not pushing the button, and try to get across. And unfortunately, on Yom Kippur, a woman and her daughter were hit. The daughter survived, the woman was killed. And she had made it to just the last lane of the road, and the guy ran the red light and she was killed. As a result of that, they went through a lot of discussions, and in the end, the rabbi told his congregation that they are to use the crosswalk with the radar detection, and that it would be acceptable on Shabbat to do that because of the importance of saving a life, which in Jewish teaching, pretty much every other law can be negated in saving of a life. And so I just wanted to bring up those couple points. Last thing, which we talked about again in kind of the Eruv and consolidating everything, is the question of, especially with growing anti-Semitism, the need to be closer together, to cluster, to have more community. A lot of these ultra-Orthodox communities, especially in New York City, have in fact semi-private security or semi-private police forces. And I know, Rabbi, we talked a little bit about security, and I don't know, maybe if we want to jump into that for just a little bit briefly before we take questions.
I would just very briefly say it's something to think about in terms of, when you have clusters of a group that's, noticeably unique and socially unique, it's just something to think about. I'm not a security expert. I leave that to the experts who really do this. I can talk about planning and the new urbanism and Jewish law. I'm comfortable as an urban planning practitioner and economic development expert, but I don't want to speak to the security needs on the ground. But I would emphasize that it's something we need to be aware of. It's certainly something we need to think about as we have these growing clusters of Orthodox Jewish communities, that are walking everywhere on Saturday. We have to think about, their protection if ever the case, would arise. It's just something we should be cognizant of. And from a planning perspective, I think now, whenever one plans for any community of any kind, any planned community, certainly for an Orthodox community, I think that that's a variable that is increasingly, for sure, being taken into account. Like, why you just mentioned, the radar camera. That's not even security, but that can be used that way as well. So the issue of cameras has come up, for example. That's not, sadly, for this tragic event you've just reported, but the issue of, we've seen it in that kind of a happenstance situation. But the issue of cameras is coming up. Some unorthodox congregations, they have that security screening coming into the buildings on Sabbath, even though otherwise no one would use electricity on the Sabbath. They would not turn on their lights on the Sabbath. They would turn them on before the Sabbath, let's say, in the bathroom or the kitchen, to go on, or use timers to pop them on and off. that are set before Sabbath. But issues of security are certainly issues that we need to take account of and include as a variable now in planning. That's just something we need to be aware of. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you, Rabbi Unger and Wiatt. Both your presentations were really great. I loved how you really hit home on walkability and how important it is, centering around educational centers, really enhancing sidewalks and streetlights to make our communities safer. And I really enjoyed hearing about how at the end of the day, it's really about a sense of community and creating community together. And I think that's really important as planners, no matter what subsection you do, whether it's transportation or land use planning, creating environments where a sense of place and a sense of community is provided is super important, and making sure the characteristics of the community are central in that development, I think, is really essential. And so I'm looking at the chat. Doesn't look like there's any questions. I did have one question. It has to do with mixed use. I noticed on a lot of the examples that you were showing, Rabbi Unger, were master planned communities, and not a lot of them showed mixed use, so commercial on the bottom and housing on top. Is there a reason that would prevent that from occurring? Or I know there's a lot of detailed nuances, so I didn't know if there was a reason preventing that, or...
No, there is no issue whatsoever. I think it's just in planned communities. That just replicates other planned communities. They're just putting, sort of like the beginning of zoning, right? Separating out, section residence from commercial. That's just sort of, either it's organic to human nature or it's, the American influence on zoning. Whichever way it turns out, that has nothing to do with Jewish law.
Okay.
So, and in fact, if you go to, more historic Jewish communities like in Borough Park, Brooklyn, you will find lots of apartments on top of retail, as well as rows and rows of private residences. So that's just the peculiarity of the modern age.
Okay.
And I think, Corinne, you would see that and again, it was hard in that one Main Street image I had of the Harish community. There is commercial on the ground floor, and then there were offices and then residential above.
Yeah,
so yeah.
I did notice it, and it almost prevented me from asking, but then I was like, hey, I'll just...
Yeah, I will say real quick, the interesting thing about Harish, and I think, Rabbi, we talked about this, I could be wrong, was, the question of what type of community is it? And so interestingly, there was a thought from the beginning that it would be a secular community, i.e. not the ultra-Orthodox. And then there was a thought, no, wait, it should be a Haredi community. And in fact, what it is about 50-50. It's mixed. There's a Haredi ultra-Orthodox mayor, but he understands that half of his community is secular, and so in fact some of the shops are open on Saturday, which is interesting.
One more thing that I think is relevant to the way we're thinking about structuring communities nowadays in America in our time and place. One thing you'll find is that, which I think is really special and something to learn from, quite frankly, you'll find wealthy, middle class, and poor ultra-Orthodox Jews living in the same communities together. In more expansive, sort of less now going up, but more historic Orthodox Jewish communities, there are certainly sections with big houses of families that, quote unquote, made it to a higher degree of affluence, and the bulk that we're talking about largely, and Wyatt and I are talking about. But because they have the same religious needs as do the more middle class and less affluent members of the Orthodox community, they will have to live in an Orthodox community, and they want to. They want to send their kids to those parochial schools. They want to go to those synagogues. They want to have access for advice, counsel, and study to those rabbis. So you'll find wealthy, middle class, and poor mingling together in the playground in terms of their children, going to the same parochial schools. They might be a street with fancier houses, but it's a much more economically and socioeconomic diverse community, notwithstanding the religious uniformity, than you'll find now in many communities that are you're asking about zoning, that's what triggered this in my head, and you'll find, which are much more stringently zoned in terms of different kind of housing that can go up in different kinds of parts of town. And that's because, quite frankly, diversity, equity, and inclusion on a socioeconomic level. So within these ultra-Orthodox communities, you'll find a lot of socioeconomic diversity, which is a valuable lesson for us to think about. There's lots of scholars talking about that sort of, over time separation of the classes because of infrastructure development and zoning. But here, rich, middle, and poor live, work, play, pray, and study together, which I think is really a valuable lesson for us.
Yeah, and I do think that's special as well. I would agree with you on that, Rabbi Unger. We do have a question from Lori. She's going to unmute herself and ask it.
Thank you, Rabbi Unger, and thank you, Wiatt, for being here, and thank you, Corrine. I have a question. I live in South Florida, and I have a friend who owns several businesses, and him and his friend, they're observant. They were looking into buying a farm, like buying farmland to raise cows, because they had a question about the meat that they were bringing in, and they were saying that, you know, there may be a big market for that. Is that a concern, or is that something that we have to plan for in Florida in general?
So I'm not sure of the kosher meat situation. If there is, I don't know if it's short in the stores, quite frankly, depending on who you talk to. There's a supply chain issue right around the country. I don't know if that's what's prompting this, but I can say what I can speak to, because I actually do follow, believe it or not, or I follow the kosher meat industry a bit, because as the country becomes a bit more of a foodie nation, lots of sort of boutique new kosher, grass-fed and other, sorts of cattle farms and, kosher food, purveyors are opening up just because it's a trend, organic, grass-fed, et cetera, in the larger community. So I don't know if it's a need just because people want more boutique types of kosher food offerings, or if there's a real need because of some kind of shortage of kosher in Florida. I can imagine there's a great population growth and you have to rely on imports from other states or other places all the time. I can imagine there might be some, supply and demand issue at work, but it might be part of a larger culture. But there's no harm in having a local homegrown Florida kosher food. It's certainly a nice idea.
Well, it doesn't look like we have any more questions, and we are at time right now. So thank you, Rabbi Unger. Thank you, Wiatt, for your great presentations again. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
A question just came through from Adrian.
Oh, okay. So it says, working as a historic preservation planner, I'm curious about concepts of preservation and cultural heritage. Is there an interest in preservation versus the new communities that were shown as examples? I work in Miami-Dade County, and there is a rich heritage here with the Jewish community. So just curious. Thanks for this very informative session.
Rabbi, do you want to go first?
I'm not quite sure. Are we referring then to older Jewish institutions that might be taken over by newer ones? Is that the framework of the question?
No, I think her question is just whether there's a strong interest in, historic preservation. And I think the answer to that is yes. Yeah, I mean,
Fraser is a historic site. I mean, the synagogue, Israel's full of, you would just say Israel's full of, synagogues that are centuries, if not millennia old. And there was the oldest congregation in North America was founded in 1654, the Spanish Portuguese Synagogue of New York, and its building is a little bit newer than that, but it's still central. Sure, certainly a veneration of history certainly would spill over onto planning in the Jewish tradition.
And obviously, if you jump over to Israel, in Jerusalem, you can't dig a single foot without finding something. And so it's a huge issue. It takes actually a lot of time to build new things. They're running into those same questions that we have about density. And, do you replace something that's 3 or 4 stories with something that's 10 or 20? And I can tell you that, again, I love Tel Aviv much more than Jerusalem. But, and Tel Aviv is a relatively new city. The oldest things there are from the late 1800s. But there's some very high-end property areas, neighborhoods, where they are doing historic preservation and then building on top with air rights as a way of getting around that question. And so I do think it's important in Jewish society, just like it is for our overall American and worldwide society.
Sometimes you'll see in older Jewish communities that become revitalized sometimes by a new Jewish population, like an ultra-Orthodox population moving in, is an older building that might have emptied out a little bit, repurposed in communities. So that's actually really nice too. An old synagogue that might have been, on a downturn in terms of attrition of families, between the 1950s and 1990s, suddenly is revitalized by a Hasidic population that might move in and use that synagogue or old JCC building or something like that. I've seen that numerous times. And so there's a sense of, ongoing continuity and vitality, which I think is part of the Jewish spirit.
Thank you again for presenting here today, both of you. It was an excellent and very informative hour well spent. So thank you all for attending. Again, this meeting was recorded and will be posted by the end of the week on the Florida APA's YouTube site. And I think Rabbi Unger will then post it on his new synagogue site or spread the word on it.
See, but I think so. I look forward to part of this conversation.
Yeah, thank you all and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.